Well, hello everybody. Welcome to, let me see if I get the title. We have Gender and Religion, Special Topics in Religion. Our topic, I guess, then, is Studies in Witchcraft in the Occult. My name is Glenn Farron. I'll be, I guess, the teacher, the professor, whatever. Online classes. First time I've taught this one for Utep, so I'm quite excited. I've taught this numerous times at my home university, way up at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So if you look on the map, go straight north until you run out of humanity. That's where I live. So it's covered in snow outside, and it's Edmonton. Anyway, so today I'll just give a little preamble introductory lecture. How I usually do these is I upload slides to Blackboard. I'll just, do my lecture along with the slides, and hopefully you'll follow along with them because they'll contain key points and what have you. So just a couple of little quick quirks. No readings. There's no there's no textbooks. All the readings have been provided for you. The first homework assignment, if I'm not mistaken, is not due this week, but the following week. Today is simply sort of a preamble, give you a sense of what you are in for, and if you want to bail out at the last minute, but also to kind of set the stage for what I want to do. I do want you to take a look at two of the readings, both the Russell reading and then the Smith reading. I ask you to do it in that order simply because, well, it makes sense. Russell's setting up the stage how a lot of scholars have studied this stuff, where Smith nicely deconstructs his model. So I would like you to do that in those orders. Be aware Smith's a slog. It's not an easy guy to suss through, but that's okay. I'll go over it in some detail, and we'll keep coming back to it throughout the term. Okay? If you have any questions, please just email me. I'm usually around. I have no life, so it's going to work out great. All right? So if you would open up the slides, I guess the slides presentation. So again, just a little preamble. I am a professor of religious studies. I have my MA and BA at from the University of Regina in the history of religion. I did a PhD at the University of Alberta with, actually I was a classmate with your director, Clayton Bench. My area of expertise is usually Christian origins and the method and theory and study of religion, but I did a lot of work and I've done a lot of teaching on the phenomenon of witchcraft and magic. So that's kind of, how I want to approach it. It's from a very religious studies perspective, but also from a critical method and theory perspective as well. So basically, what is the point of taking this class on witchcraft and the occult in the first place? Or better yet, why is it perhaps important to take this class from the perspective of religious studies as opposed to theology or anthropology or what have you? Well, I mean, again, beyond the fact that it's got a cool title, Studies in Witchcraft and the Occult, what I hope to do is not just look at all these kind of cool magic-y stuff that folks have classified as being witchcraft or what have you, or occultish stuff. What I want you to do is start to question the terms. What does it mean when someone says something is magic versus something else? Or when somebody calls somebody a witch or claims to be a witch? What does occult mean in a technical, but also in a commonsensical and a way in which people classify things? I want us to think about the terms, not just the things that we're talking about. Because even though these things, I'm thinking, to most people seem pretty straightforward, magic, occult, religion, all this kind of stuff, they may seem self-contained or obvious, but they really are not. I teach in a lot of intro classes, and I do a lot of work on the method and theory of religion, and I can't define what religion is, let alone what magic and all these other things are. So I want us to look at the various relationships and how these things are actually constructed, and I want you to think about these things. Okay, so let me just see here. So yeah, that's on your slide too. It kind of gives you a sense of the key issues that perhaps are at play. So if you would jump to slide 3, the first question I kind of want you to think about is Gandalf a witch? Now, again, I'm hoping folks are familiar with Lord of the Rings and other popular representations. I mean, we'll talk about Harry Potter, as you can see in the syllabus, but if you think about it, is the figure of Gandalf, can we consider him a witch? Now, generally speaking, a witch encodes somebody who's female or feminine or something to that effect. And Gandalf's simply a dude, right? He doesn't get that same classification. Generally, he is considered a wizard. Now, wizard carries with it a certain positive element, where witch certainly does not, especially in the sort of conceptual horizon of something like Lord of the Rings. If you're a female magic user who is good, you are an elf queen. If you're a witch, you're considered negative. So there is this, right off the top on the term witch, we have somebody who is feminine or female. We usually have something that's kind of negative in connotation and is juxtaposed against the male, I get, for lack of a better word. Now, if you would jump to slide 4, here's a picture of the Pope. Is the Pope a magician, right? This may seem like a not obvious question, but we both, we have, he has a magic stick. He is an old dude. He does a lot of the same kinds of things as, say, Gandalf, or the figure of Gandalf, protects us from evil, can turn things into other things. The body and blood of Jesus. So would we consider him a wizard or a witch or somebody who does magic? Now, I think most people would probably say no, that they cut, even though they may look like similar figures, they might cut a similar figure, that they are fundamentally not the same thing. Gandalf is a wizard, a fiction, and the Pope is not. Now, that being said, Pope Francis is a different figure than the actual human being who became Pope Francis, much like Ian McKellen became Gandalf. They took on this role and this mantle. But there is something, on one hand kind of similar about them, but there is this common sense element that I know deep down that the Pope is not a magician and that Gandalf is. That there is this common sense distinction between them. Now, again, this common sense distinction may seem obvious, but if you note at the top of the slide, it says hoc est corpus meum. This is a Latin phrase taken from the Latin Mass, and it appears that in the Middle Ages, when Catholic priests were giving the Mass to folks, they weren't necessarily literate or actually knew their Latin, so they would just sort of parrot it back. And what's interesting is scholars have claimed that hoc est corpus meum was mispronounced as hocus pocus, which makes me think, is the distinction between magic and religion, between the Pope and Gandalf, Catholicism, and Lord of the Rings, all that different? Okay, so if you just jump to slide 5. So again, I guess another way of framing the question is, can Gandalf be the Pope? Do they function in similar ways? And again, a lot of times people get hooked on this notion that no, he's different. He's a fictitious character that's distinct from, say, religion, much like magic is distinct from religion as well. Now, something to consider. I'm sure most of you have read Harry Potter. I admit I have not read all the books. I have seen all the movies, which I know is clear heresy, at least according to the folks who have told me about this. But, I mean, Harry Potter as a fictitious world raised a lot of ire for people who thought it was smuggling in some form of religion. So again, the blinds between what gets to be religion, fiction, magic, all these kinds of things, I hope to convince you down the road that they are perhaps not as clear-cut as we would hope them actually to be, okay? So again, there is this notion that while people generally think, religion is over here, magic is over here, fiction is somewhere else, that all of these classifications certainly morph together and can be a variety of different configurations and a variety of different overlaps, okay? So if you just jump to slide 6. So again, as I said, there's a certain common sense understanding that these things are just fundamentally different. That religion is distinct from magic, magic is distinct from science, and weirdly enough, science is distinct from religion. And again, I kind of get that. Like when I'm talking to my friends, I say, "Oh, well, that's not a that's a religious claim, not a scientific claim." And I make all these sort of classifications when I'm just chatting with my friends or just chatting amongst folks outside of an academic setting. But the thing I want us to be aware of, that this conversation, this common sense usage, isn't good enough for something like religious studies or academia. We need to be more rigorous in our definitions, and that is something that we're going to harp on, I apologize, over and over again in the course, is that our definitions need to be a lot more rigorous if we're going to classify these things and think about them in some sort of reasonable fashion. And that's kind of what I want you to do when you read the Russell reading, but also when you follow it up with the Smith reading. He has some pretty strong opinions about what it is that is magic and whether it's a useful classification for academic discourse. And he is pretty clear that it simply is not. Now, something to consider as well is that by and large, at least at this stage in our class, magic has predominantly been constructed as that which is distinct from religion. That somehow these two things are just different. Like again, Gandalf and the Pope, both old dudes, both have magic sticks, both can save you from evil, one from Satan, one from the Balrog. As you can tell, I'm clearly a nerd with all this stuff behind me. Since in the Lord of the Rings references, they also have magical powers, turning bread into the body of Christ, these kinds of things. But we know for a fact that they are different, or we assume, or we operate under the assumption that these things are different. And usually that difference is, despite the fact that everything looks the same, we just have this gut instinct. So, instance, why isn't Jesus a necromancer? He brings back people from the dead, but he's not considered evil or problematic. The figure of Jesus is usually portrayed as positive, or what he does is miraculous. Somebody else does it, like in The Walking Dead or something, it is considered magic and somewhat of a problem. Now, one of the things that this distinction kind of makes problematic, my apologies, I usually turn off my phone, is that this idea of this distinction really does dictate how we define things like magic. By and large, magic looks like religion, acts like religion, but it cannot be religion. There is something that makes it fundamentally distinct from those kinds of discourses. Now, one of the funny things that we need to consider is, well, if magic is not like religion, then I should be able to come up with a really good working definition of what constitutes religion. And again, we'll get into this as we move through the class. But the thing is, I can't come up with a definition of religion. If you've taken any of these courses with me or perhaps Dr. Bench, religion is not something that academics can easily classify. I've been trying for like a decade. I can't come up with a definition for religion. Every time one appears, every time somebody deploys it, it tends to fall flat. One of the best rationalizations or ways of talking about it is, again, by Jonathan Smith, and he said, it's not that we can't define religion, it's just that we can define it in 50 different ways. And that's something to consider. Religion itself is not a stable classification. It shifts over time, shifts over location, and it shifts shifts depending on the people. So I hope you can see a conceptual problem right there, is that if magic is deployed as that which is not religion, and I can't define religion, then what the hell am I talking about? And that's something I want us to think about as we move through the material. Not just what is magic and what is not, but how these classifications kind of break down. Okay? Anyway, enough of that rambling. Let's talk about our first little chunk of work. I want you to, jump to slide 7, and I want to give you a little preamble about the Russell reading. Not because I want you to get out of reading him, you have more than enough time to do so, but I want to kind of note a couple of things that I want you to be aware of as you're reading through this material. Now, The best thing about the Russell reading for me is that I don't agree with most of what he says, but what he does is provide a really good summary of the standard model in which people have looked at things that we would call religion throughout academic discourse. He essentially spells out witchcraft, magic, and what have you in this very straightforward way that most scholars have no issue with. So I'm going to cover the material in a very similar fashion that he has. But I'm also going to make a point of being quite critical of how he does it to kind of show you the problems. And again, this is where Smith comes in. So again, read Russell and then read Smith and see if you can see the problems that somebody like Russell would have for somebody like Smith. Okay? So anyway, so we jump down to slide 8. So at the very beginning of the reading, you will see that the framework that he is working with when he says that the actual word witch stems from the Old English word Wicca, which means sorcerer, and Wiccan, which means to cast a spell. But even if the word is Old English in meaning or in origin, he talks about this notion of witchcraft or sorcery as existing in places where Old English would simply not have been relevant or even influential in any way, shape, or form. Now, this may seem minor, but this does have a couple of implications for how he actually constructs his understanding of witchcraft. And I want you to think about that. One being that to him, witchcraft is not simply an English concept or even an English practice. In fact, he uses it to talk about things like the ancient Greco-Roman world, so Greece and Rome 2,000 odd years ago, all the way up to the Middle Ages, to the modern world, North America, Europe, but also into Africa, where there's been no influence with this construction of magic. So there's no sort of overlap between what is sort of magic in Europe and North America and what is magic perhaps in Africa or in the ancient world. For him, Wicca, witch, what have you, is in a sense a generic feature of cultural life throughout the world. It's a universal that can be applied everywhere. You can look around the world and find witchcraft. For him, it essentially exists in the wild. Now, in addition to this sort of universal element that he claims of witchcraft, he also says that at certain points in history there was something that is beyond simple sorcery, but there's sort of this diabolical element that got loaded onto it as well. And in particular, this is something that happened in the medieval period, especially in medieval Europe, where you had a lot of added elements of Christian theology being part of it. So not only were witches in this context those who cast spells, but these were folks who were the antithesis to something like Christianity. They had made a pact with Satan. They were there to thwart all of Christendom, and as such, they needed to be stopped, and usually pretty violently. And according to Russell, when this is coupled with the social unrest, you have for what essentially is the foundation of the witch craze, or a period of time between 1450 and 1750, which is a long time for a craze when you think about it, during which a significant amount of folks, the vast majority, which happened to be women, which is something we're going to focus on as well, were accused and executed for the crime of witchcraft. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Russell claims that about 100,000 people, again, the majority of women, were executed for the so-called crime of witchcraft during this 300 or so year period known as the witch craze. That being said, his numbers aren't necessarily set in stone. There's still some debate about what the numbers actually were, and this sort of ranges all over the place. We have numbers going as low as 60,000 all the way up to 9.5 million. Now, most academics are on the low side. An academic can mean somebody who does research in a university. So Russell, myself, other folks who have studied these things, I would say the numbers are probably 60 to 100,000. But some folks who claim an affiliation with the ancient Wiccans, or the folks who they say, Wiccans, I should put that in quote, ancient pagans, or even folks who died during the witch hunts. And in particular, I'm thinking of neo-pagans, folks who are practice their tradition now, a new age or a new religious movement, but claim some sort of affiliation to the past. They actually claim that the numbers sometimes are substantially larger. And I want us to think about that as well. And I don't want to say one is right, one is wrong. I do think one is right and wrong, but I want us to investigate the rhetoric behind these kinds of claims. Okay? Now, Russell also talks about a third type of witchcraft, which he calls contemporary witchcraft, which most scholars claim, I think correctly, emerged out of the neo-pagan and occult influences of the late 19th century. And this is where we get sort of modern interpretations of things like witchcraft, or Wicca, or goddess movements, or what have you. Okay? Now, if you just jump to slide 9. So Russell hints at some of the details of what constitutes this neo-paganism, at least for him. He talks about during the mid-19th century, we had authors who claimed that the European witches, the practice of European witchcraft, was actually a pre-Christian fertility cult that, goes back thousands upon thousands of years. Sorry, it's way too early here. That it's somehow this remnant of a pre-Christian fertility cult. And I should point out, this actually speaks to a major dynamic that exists in modern Wicca, modern witchcraft. But back at the point that he's referring to is this neo-paganism is sort of a nebulous category that encompassed a whole variety of groups. Druids, Satru, I think I'm saying that right, Wicca, occult practices, and I don't mean these in derogatory terms, just the kind of alternative practices that were going on in the 19th and 20th century. Paganism in particular would be sort of affiliated with this. In fact, the word pagan is kind of interesting. Incidentally, it's a Latin phrase. Originally, it meant one who lived in the village or out of the city, but it also had a certain negative connotation. It meant a villager or rustic. A better term would be a hick or a redneck or a bumpkin or something to that effect. So calling somebody a pagan in the ancient world was actually an insult. It meant you were uneducated, probably barbaric, dangerous, uncivilized, these kinds of things. So this term got reappropriated in the 19th century, and people kind of grabbed onto it. But we'll get into that in a little more detail. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But anyway, according to Russell, then as Christianity spread into Europe, the term pagan moved outside of its sort of straight Greco-Roman context and began to be imposed upon those that the Christians of the ancient world started finding who were not part of their tradition. So I'm Christian, I go into a new area, there's a whole bunch of other traditions there, but I just classify them all as pagan. They're not me, therefore they are pagan. Even though they might not have a lot in common, it'd be sort of like classifying the world under, I'm going to classify everybody as American and everybody else, or for my context, Canadian and everybody else. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Everybody else can include folks like yourselves in the United States, people in, the UK, China, all over the world, which there might not be much overlap, for instance. So in a way, this sort of classification of pagan really does a disservice in sort of looking at the differences and the nuances of these kinds of classifications. So keep that in mind, of course, as we move through the material. Now, of course, the term pagan was applied as European culture sort of was conquering various parts of the world. So if I encountered somebody, if I'm a European conquistador and I encounter somebody in South America or the First Nations in North America, they are pagan as well. They are the same ilk as folks I might encounter in Africa, Asia, all these other places. So again, it's this one small group and everybody else sort of combined. Perhaps a better way would be blue and not blue. I'm going to classify the world in that way. Now, this term with its negative connotations started to wane as folks in the 19th century started to think about their um, uh, um, I guess, new religious movements. People started talking about what they thought of as sort of the lost history of pre-Christian Europe. There was a lot of implied criticism of Christianity as well. People wanted to go back to a simpler time. We're going through things like the Industrial Revolution, so that would have been quite shocking to folks. We'll get into all this as we move through the material, so don't get too hung up on the details right now. But the idea was that these pagan folks were not inbred bumpkins, but they were actually, these lovely nature-worshipping folks who sang Kumbaya and held hands and all this kind of stuff, when we really don't have any evidence for that. But the point is that this is sort of their nostalgia of how they reimagine the past. So these 19th century folks started thinking about these people, imagining what they were up to, and inventing what they were all about. And then putting that forth as their kind of tradition, okay? As I said, this often had a good deal of criticism implied against Christianity and traditional organized religions as well. So while we don't see this happening all the time in historical periods that we'll be looking at, one thing to look out for is that the practices that derive from the 19th century are usually constructed as being in opposition to Christianity. If Christianity does this, then we do this, okay? So there is this sort of need to construct themselves as fundamentally different, okay? Keep that mechanism in mind. Don't worry about whether it goes back to the past or not. I always joke, when it comes to religions, none of it's real, none of it's true, so let's look at the rhetoric and the construction about it. I do that to be kind of pithy, be a bit of a smart aleck, but the idea is that let's take not the claims necessarily at face value, but look at the conceptual traction that is being gained by these kinds of things. Okay? So anyway, if you would be so kind as to jump to the last slide. So anyway, Russell sees modern witchcraft as emerging from this context of neo-paganism, along with a renewed interest in things that we'll call the occult in the 19th century. And he does actually see very little overlap. Oh, I should have jumped on to slide 9. He does seem, sorry, go back to slide 9 if you'd be so kind. He sees very little overlap between contemporary witchcraft, what he sees as Wicca, and sort of the witchcraft, so-called witchcraft of the Middle Ages and antiquity. In fact, he kind of is a bit condescending when he calls it, a quote here, a naive, genteel nature religion, which kind of is a little condescending, but that's pretty typical in how folks have generally studied things like Wicca, but also new traditions as well, and that's something I want us to think about also. So anyway, Russell's biases aside, this tripartite model, this tripartite model I'm sorry, I got a lecture later today too, of the witchcraft phenomena is actually quite common, and a lot of other scholars have appropriated this and sort of run with it. So if you please would go to the final slide. So anyway, for Russell, witchcraft then can refer to traditional, presumably ancient sorcery or magical practices that can be found in various societies and cultures around the world, essentially what he calls simple sorcery, which again smacks of the kind of condescension, but again, he's a medievalist and sometimes they can be pretty condescending. Now, it can also, according to Russell, refer to the phenomenon of the witch hunts and the witch craze that existed in medieval Europe, but also in North America. Salem is a good example. There are also examples, if at somewhat smaller scale, in what is now Canada. So the eastern part of North America and the colonies there certainly had a part to play in this. But the idea is that witchcraft in this instance was understood to have some affiliation with satanic practice or what have you. And also it can mean modern witches, modern Wiccan practices as well. Now, he claims that they do not necessarily have any direct overlap, but they represent essentially the same kind of thing. So I want you to think about that. Is he correct in making this claim, or is he wrong? Or can we salvage something out of this claim? Is he, like, what good can we get out of such a classification schema versus abandoning this kind of model? Okay, so again, that's sort of the first lecture for this week. I'll probably start uploading stuff from the Greco-Roman period. I don't know. Maybe a little bit later on this week. It's actually a complete train wreck right now. My partner, she just moved in, so me and our stuff and all the cats are trying to figure things out. So it's been fun. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm always available online. Any questions, and yeah, if anything is unclear, I'm sure there's going to be mistakes. In particular, Blackboard and I are not friends. If something isn't working, please get a hold of me. Hopefully we can resolve that, and yeah, thanks very much. I will see you all next time. Okay, take care.